Hi, folks, and welcome to First Bite, Fed, Fun, and Functional, a speech therapy podcast sponsored by SpeechTherapyPD.com. I am your host on this nerd venture, Michelle Dawson, MS, CCC-SLP, CLC, the All Things Peds SLP. I am a colleague in the trenches of home health early intervention right there with you. I run my own private practice, Heartwood Speech Therapy, here in Coletown, South Carolina, and I guest lecture nationwide on best practices for early intervention for the medically complex and fragile child. First Bite's mission is short and sweet, to bring light, hope, knowledge, and joy to the pediatric clinician, parent, or advocate.
By way of a nerdy conversation, so there's plenty of laughter too.
In this podcast, we cover everything from AAC to breastfeeding,
ethics on how to run a private practice,
pediatric dysphagia to clinical supervision,
and all other topics in the world of pediatric speech pathology. Our goal is to bring evidence-based practice straight to you by interviewing subject matter experts,
to break down the communication barriers so that we can access the knowledge of their fields.
Or, as a close friend says, to build the bridge.
By bringing other professionals and experts in our field together, we hope to spark advocacy, joy, and passion for continuing to grow and advance care for our little ones.
Every fourth episode, I join in. I'm Erin Forward, MSP, CCC-SLP, the Yankee by way of Rochester, New York transplant who actually inspired this journey. I bring a different perspective, that of a newish clinician with experience in early intervention, pediatric acute care, and nonprofit pediatric outpatient settings.
So sit back, relax, and watch out for all our squirrels and enjoy this geeky gig brought to you by SpeechTherapyPD.com. Hey, this is Michelle Dawson, and I need to update my disclosure statements. So my non-financial disclosures. I actively volunteer with Feeding Matters, National Foundation of Swallowing Disorders, NFOSD, Dysphagia Outreach Project, DOP. I am a former treasurer with the Council of State Association Presidents, CSAP, a past president of the South Carolina Speech, Language, and Hearing Association, SCISHA, a current Board of Trustees member with the Communication Disorders Foundation of Virginia, and I am a current member of ASHA SIG 13, SCISHA, the Speech Language Hearing Association of Virginia, SHAV, a member of the National Black Speech Language Hearing Association in Basel, and Dysphagia Research Society, DRS. Additionally, I volunteer with ASHA as the topic chair for the Pediatric Feeding Disorder Planning Committee for the ASHA 2023 convention in Boston, and I hope you make it out there. My financial disclosures include receiving compensation for First Bite podcast from SpeechTherapyPD.com, as well as from additional webinars and for webinars associated with Understanding Dysphagia, which is also a podcast with SpeechTherapyPD.com. And I currently receive a salary from the University of South Carolina in my work as adjunct professor and student services coordinator. And I receive royalties from the sale of my book, Chasing the Swallow: Truth, Science, and Hope for Pediatric Feeding and Swallowing Disorders, as well as compensation for the CEUs associated with it from SpeechTherapyPD.com. So those are my current disclosure statements. Thanks, guys.
Hi, this is Erin Forward, and these are my disclosure statements. I receive a salary from Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center. I receive royalties from Speech Therapy PD for my work with First Bite Podcast and other presentations. I also receive payment for sales from the First Bite Boutique, which I have with Michelle Dawson. For non-financial disclosures, I am a member of ASHA and a member of Special Interest Group 13. I also am a volunteer for Feeding Matters. I am a contributor for the book Chasing the Swallow with Michelle Dawson, which I receive no financial gain. I also am a member of the South Carolina Coalition Committee with ICDL-DIF full-time.
The views and opinions expressed in today's podcast do not reflect the organizations associated with the speakers and are their views and opinions solely.
Okay, everybody, I am so excited about today's guest because honestly, Jenn didn't know me from Adam. And then I reached out and she came and she showed up at the AAC Palooza at James Madison. And my students raved about her. They loved her. She brought in all these devices. And then she let me bow out not so gracefully on a recording because we got new internet and the new internet isn't as good as the old internet, which I don't understand the purpose in having now fiber optics when the old box upstairs worked just as well. But here we are, here I sit. Anywho, she said yes and she came back. And y'all, this is absolutely a crucial conversation because we're going to talk about eye gaze, but also talk about the eye. And let's be honest, very few of us had an in-depth AAC class, much less one that actually talked about the eye. And I am so excited. Also, when I told Aaron geeked out, and then Aaron was like, "Ooh, I'm coming to that one." So we are tag teaming this together because we're that nerdy and excited. So Jenn, hi, thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. That's awesome. I am also a nerd about this kind of stuff. So it sounds like that'll be a fun conversation.
Okay, so I literally met you cold calling, trying to get devices for James Madison. And so, Jenn Rubenstein, you're with Eyegaze, which is actually the company is called Eyegaze.
You got it.
That kind of tripped me out, I'll be honest, because I was like, but where's the rest of the name? I assumed there was going to be another name, and it was short and sweet to the point. But Aaron and I like to start with the backstory. Can you take us from the beginning? How did you find this field of speech pathology?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will tell you a little bit more about the name because that's actually kind of fun as well. So I am a speech language pathologist. I actually did have the great privilege of having a fantastic AAC course. And I also had one of my placements in grad school, did a lot of AAC. All of that said, did I know anything about the eye or about eye tracking at all? The answer is still no. So it's definitely not. I mean, it could be an entire course in itself. It could probably be an entire semester worth of classes. So after I finished grad school, I went to grad school up in Boston. And I'm actually originally from the DC area. So I grew up in Northern Virginia. Ended up back in this area for my CF. I did my CF in a large subacute rehab facility in Washington, DC, and then stayed on as a staff clinician after I got my Cs, ended up being there for 11 and a half years. And those final 2.5 years were as the director of rehab. I tell people sometimes is that I started there for my CF and then just never left.
Also, wait, director of rehab, did you oversee OT and PT as well?
Yeah, the whole department for a 259 bed facility. Yeah.
That's refreshing because to have a DOR that's actually an SLP and they get it because the productivity codes are so different for speech than they are.
We could do a whole podcast on that. I can honestly say I don't miss it. I feel for everyone who is out there working in the SNF world. I actually left right when the big Medicare change happened. So when I was there, it was PPS. It's now PDPM. If folks work in that realm, they know what those letters mean. If not, don't worry about it. But it tremendously changed the way the reimbursement structure works. And so I am not as familiar with the way it is currently, but I know that that is pretty exclusively Medicare. So there are still some folks who are working. I think some state Medicaids are still using the PPS system. So it's tough. On the one hand, you want to give the best possible treatment to your patients. But on the other hand, how do you keep the lights on? So, if everything closes down and no one has a job, then no one gets therapy. So it's tough. It's very tough. So I'm out of that realm now. It actually happened completely coincidentally. I had been looking elsewhere. I was there for over a decade. And if you think of the decade from basically 2008 to 2018, just thinking about what technology was in that time, from the time I started, and we're talking about a nursing home, you're talking about a lot of geriatric patients, so older folks. When I first started, if I put something with a touch screen in front of someone, a lot of times there would be, I don't want to break it. If I touch it, what's going to happen? And by the time I left, everyone was coming in with their own iPhones. They put Wi-Fi in the facility. People were coming in with laptops and still working while they were there. So that decade was just a huge shift. I do not know off the top of my head when the first iPhone came out, but I think that was really, there have been touchscreen communication devices for a long time, but it really became accessible to, you could say, the masses when it wasn't necessarily a dedicated device. You could actually pull up, like a memory game on an iPad that you got as a free trial app. So things AAC wise in that setting, I think changed very, very dramatically while I was there. I didn't get the opportunity to do too much of it while I was there, but I took it upon myself to do some CEU courses outside of my job that were AAC focused because it was just something that I personally had an interest in. And I could, again, do an entire hour just talking about how I landed here, but I actually just celebrated my 4th anniversary. So I started 3 months exactly to the day before everything shut down in March of 2020. So right, I started in December of 2019, had about 3 months to start to kind of get my feet under me in this brand new position before everything changed.
I joke I take full credit for causing the pandemic because I got my husband to take me to a ballet on Friday, March 13th. And if you knew Christian and you knew, and he had thrown his back out, but it was my birthday. So he powered through on pain pills in the ballet. We made it to essentially intermission, and he was like, "Baby, I can't sit up." And I was like, "Hell froze over because you went to the ballet. That's why the universe broke." So okay. Well, then, how did you find out about the field of speech therapy?
Oh, so my entrance into speech was different than I think every single one of my classmates in grad school. When I first went to college, I did not graduate with this degree, but initially I started off college as a voice major. So I had done all kinds of choir, show choir, musical theater, things like that, all through high school, and then went to college. I thought to do vocal performance. It did not take. So that lasted about a semester. I changed majors, I changed schools, but I did keep singing. I did symphonic choir and a cappella groups, things like that. And in addition to that, I had a lot of friends in the local music scene. So in the very early, I guess we're calling them the aughts, the early aughts in the DC, Baltimore area, there were a lot of rock, hard rock, metal, melodic metal. So when you're going to see a band, this is not necessarily like a big concert in a stadium. This is, small bars, 2 or 3 bands, everyone kind of knows each other. And if you go to a concert, if the guitar player breaks a string, they say, they either switch out a guitar with someone else or they take some time to change the string while the drummer plays a little something or the singer tells some jokes. But if it's the singer and something happens to their voice, your show is done, your tour is done, there goes your livelihood. So that was actually my path. I went to grad school specifically thinking that I was going to specialize in voice disorders. I did not. I think the internet is a bit more now than it was when I was looking for grad schools. I did not know what I was walking into and what the field of speech looked like. So was very surprised when I got there. Also, I had been out of college. So I had already graduated. I was working as a professional proofreader at a marketing company. So kind of did the scenic route when I got there. Did not even know that dysphagia was in our scope of practice. So kind of discovered the medical piece and really, really loved that. And so I really focused on, my plan had always been to work with adults. So I actually fought to not have a school placement. I was able to do 2 medical placements and forego a school placement. And then one of those, not one of my medical placements, but actually one of my very first clinical placements was a specialty school working with students from elementary age through age 20. And most of them used some type of AAC. So that happened kind of by accident. I did a placement in an acute care hospital that was almost exclusively swallowing. I did a placement at a specialty hospital in their voice clinic. So that was 100% voice. So primarily adults, a lot of professional voice users, so singers, but also clergy people, teachers, lawyers, people who you are speaking as your job. So, if something goes wrong there, there's going to be a big problem. Are you going to be able to continue to do this job or to live this life? But not only that, you would have people who were not necessarily using their voice as their primary job earning their living, but you might have someone who sang on the side doing something. Like, I worked with a young woman who was a soloist in her church choir, and that was a huge part of her life. And then what happens if you're not able to perform? So yeah, that's how I ended up in grad school in the first place. So we did that story a little bit backwards. So then what happened after I finished grad school. Just kind of stumbled into the medical.
Yeah, I went in to grad school for AAC. I worked at a school in Pittsburgh in undergrad that they were primarily AAC users. They had multi-disability classrooms and then autism classrooms. And so I would help out at lunch, and I would sit with some of the autism classrooms, and they'd tell me what they wanted on their device. And they had a lot of Eyegaze users. Like, kids would come in and use their device to ask other kids to prom. And it was just like, it was the best environment. So like, I went in, I was like, I'm going to do AAC. I'm going to do medically complex. I was like, I don't want to touch swallowing. And then I went with Michelle, and I was like, I actually really love this too. But when I went into the school I was at was very into literacy. And I was like, I didn't know that we, there's so many things that we do. I had no idea.
It's wild how broad the umbrella is. If you do burn out, which happens in our field for sure, there are so many things you can do still within that umbrella. Or you can do something like what I did, which is, yes, I am not, like, I have my Cs, I have my license in a few states. I am not practicing directly under those and billing for services, but I think of what I'm doing now as like SLP adjacent.
Okay, so you and I haven't worked together for a patient, but the folks back in South Carolina, Wyatt Franken, he has his bachelor's degree in speech pathology, and he's with Talk to Me. And then Kelsey Peterson, she's with Talk to Me, but she has her C's. That I could go to them on cases that I needed help for. Like Dr. Carol Page, she was the director of the South Carolina Assistive Technology Program for years. And in South Carolina is so small, they only have the one there at it's housed through the University of South Carolina School of Medicine, which is kind of interesting that it was like in that. But like, being able to go to you and say, hey, I have a case, I need guidance, I need help. You're SLP adjacent, but you're subject matter expert. And that's what, and folks, it is okay to go to the subject matter expert and say, help. Like, we don't have to know it all, because we need our SLP adjacents to come in and say, okay, but have you considered this? Because this is the thing that it is that they do all the time, and they know it like that. Like, Wyatt once taught me how to connect an eye gaze onto the stand, because I couldn't figure out how to work the hooks. But also, I don't do well with a basic screwdriver some days. So like, those are really complicated. But
Yeah, I mean, we talk to people all the time to kind of troubleshoot and throw around ideas. And obviously, I work for this company, but first and foremost, I'm an SLP. I have my Cs. Those are the ethics that I am bound by. And it's not necessarily, well, I'm only going to talk to you if it is specific to this device. Sometimes I get to, take off vendor hat and put on SLP hat and say, have we tried, switch access? Can we call in the OT to see if maybe there's something that with a head array that might make sense? Will a sip and puff make sense? Will some kind of foot pedal, not an expert in that, but neither is the SLP. It's a lot of times going to be PT, OT, respiratory. We're calling in a team. Like, I'm working with a patient right now up in Pennsylvania who we did the initial trial. We went in knowing we were going to have some questions, ended up with questions. At least we knew what questions to ask. Sometimes that's the biggest difficulty. We went back in last week and brought the OT. So we had all three of us in the room, had multiple things to try, had some switches, had a joystick. Like, our company's name is Eyegaze. I am going to come back and talk about that in a second. So that is what we really specialize in, but we recognize that's not going to be appropriate for every person. And that doesn't mean okay, well, you don't get anything. That means, all right, this might not be the right path. What other path can we go down that might make the most sense for you in terms of access? So yeah, let me pick up that thread so I don't lose it again. So yeah, you mentioned you were curious about the name. So for folks who are listening, if you are familiar with eye tracking as an access method, and if you've been around for a little while, you might be familiar with the company and just not recognize it by the name Eyegaze. So we've actually been around since the late 1980s. We are one of the oldest eye tracking communication companies. We're actually based in Fairfax, Virginia. And prior to the end of 2019, the company official name was LC Technologies. So that might be a name that folks have been familiar with. Over the years, the device has always been the Eyegaze Edge. The website has always been eyegaze.com. The phone number has always been 1-800-Eyegaze. So there was a rebrand that happened actually right before I started with the company, just to clarify that across all of the different areas, because you already have Eyegaze in all these different places, but would you know that LC Technologies was eyegaze.com? So it made sense to just make everything. So that little piece.
You've been around since the 80s. I have been around since the 80s. I am 40 and fabulous and coming in on the home stretch. I'm 41. But like, I gotta be honest. We were talking with the boys yesterday. What were your favorite video games? My favorite video game as a kid was the duck. Remember the duck hunt? And then my dad would yell at me because I would put the gun, the like little Nintendo gun on the screen and like try to like, because that's how I could keep track of it. And my dad was like, "You're just right? You shot the duck. Yay." But like, I don't think of Eyegaze technology as being from the 80s because we had plastic guns for like Nintendos. So like that's kind of crazy to me.
Yeah, it was a bit before my time. I have seen the pictures, but think about what a computer looked like at that time. Now we're using these very slim touch screen, slip it in a sleeve and, throw it in your backpack. At the time, it was basically the entire table. So you would have this monitor, and it was this big heavy tube monitor. You would have your tower that was the actual computer, and then even the camera was just this enormous piece of equipment. And a lot of people who were trying this for the first time, they'd never used a computer before. So things have definitely changed since then. And the display on the screen, I mean, I am also a product of the 80s. It sounds like I'm a tad bit older than you. Just a tad. Just a tad.
Aaron, say nothing.
But I'm young at heart. That's fine. There were video games there that had very basic, like dot kind of graphics. I remember in elementary school, we had I believe it was an Apple II GS, and the screen was black with green text. And like that was, I think, my like maybe second or third grade. We got to take little trips down the hall to the computer lab. And so when you're thinking about what the display looked like, the display was very simple, very plain, text only. But we actually still have, it's been updated, but we still have the communication program that was being used at that point in time. Like I said, it has been updated a bit, but at the time it was a very basic keyboard and then very simple phrase pages that you're just thinking of a grid. I have one next to me. I want so badly to show you. This is a podcast. That is not the right medium to be here. Let me show this off. But I can probably send you
the screen. Send us a picture. We need that.
Yes, I will definitely do that. I can send you all kinds of screenshots. And the thing is, if you have someone today who is not particularly familiar with technology, not comfortable with technology, a lot of people in their day-to-day work, even if they're not big into computers and tablets at home, they might have a computer they have to use for work. But there are plenty of people who either, for whatever reason, are not using a computer at work, or they're already retired and hadn't made that transition yet. There's no prerequisite to be tech savvy to need some type of AAC. So we do have that very plain, very basic communication program available for folks that would really just rather not have bells and whistles. They're not looking for word prediction. They just want, like, I look at the letter T and it types a T the end. Many of the kids that we're working with, that It's the complete opposite. They've been used to screens from the get-go, but this is not, you don't have to choose between them. It always comes with both. But it's always there if someone wants something that's just stripped down, very plain, dark background, couple lines on the screen, and that's it. But yeah, I mean, I've seen pictures from what our original medical director had done. She would print out pictures and just tape them to the screen for using with kids who weren't literate yet, because that's what you did. But in the very, very, very early, we're talking about 1989, 1991, like that's that's what they were doing with kiddos.
The boys and I have started watching Young Sheldon, and it's staged at the late 80s. And as you're describing this, I'm imagining like the characters from Young Sheldon, like putting together an Eyegaze board on like a computer there. But it turned out quite well in Michelle Land, as you were like describing these little narrations. Yes, love this. Okay. So limited experience with Eyegaze in general. And I remember very, very long time ago, probably close to 11 years ago, I was up visiting Carol at the assistive tech office, and it was one of my first couple visits. I was talking to her about a patient, and she was the first person to talk to me about Eyegaze. She was like, have you considered this? And I was like, well, no, the patient has a cortical vision impairment. And she was like, that doesn't prohibit them from accessing an Eyegaze as an option. But my limited experience is filtered through the lens of my husband's brother has a cortical vision impairment. And so like I'm used to thinking of it in the terms of Uncle Matthew, right? And then over the years, I've had other patients. But can you kind of just talk to us some about the eye and the power of the eye and how the eye interfaces with the Eyegaze?
Yeah, and it's interesting that you started the question talking about CVI. I feel like that's not just a whole podcast for itself. That's an entire like semester long grad school course that I really wish that we had had. All of the names are escaping me, but I do have some folks that I can point you towards. There is one person that I have been directed to find more information from, the person who literally wrote the book, and they're based in Pittsburgh. And I apologize that the name is not one that is at the forefront of my brain. But yeah, CVI is fascinating in that it is not necessarily one thing. So you've seen one student with CVI, you've seen one student with CVI. So the next student might have the same diagnosis and a diagnosis of CVI, and what that actually means for them is very different. So, but in general, so how eye tracking works, right? Eye tracking is, in general, a method of determining where someone is looking. And when I'm talking about a camera and eye tracking, how that works, I'm doing air quotes. I know that's not a thing that people in podcast land can see. So when I'm saying things like that, that is not specific to the device that is manufactured by the company I work for. This is true across the board for any eye tracker, whether it's being used for gaming, being used for accessibility, being used. I know some cars have it built into the dashboard now. Like, this is just how eye tracking works. So you have a camera or multiple cameras that take pictures of either one or both eyes, and those images are digitized and analyzed to determine the gaze location, where you are looking. That gaze data can be passively collected, so that can be used for analysis and research, or it can be used immediately as an access method. So every single eye tracker on the market today uses some amount of infrared light to illuminate the pupil, and pictures are taken to track the reflection of that light. So picture an eye. Now, I am used to doing this with a screen that I can use to illustrate. So in the absence of a diagram, you can look in a mirror, or I can share the documents from our recent ASHA presentation if you're interested. So the anatomy I want to think about are the pupil, the iris, the cornea, and the eyelid. So the cornea is the clear, dome-shaped surface that covers the front of the eye. The pupil is the opening that allows light to pass through. The iris, which is the colored area, so like mine are hazel, can make the pupil opening or the aperture of the eye larger or smaller. Inside the eye is the lens, which is a transparent structure that focuses light onto the retina. And the retina is the light-sensitive nerve layer that lines the back of the eye. So this is inside the back of the eye. And that allows the optic nerve to carry signals to the visual cortex in the brain to assemble into images that we can see and understand. I know that's an awful lot in a very short time without pictures.
Okay, so one, Cleveland Clinic has a fantastic, if you Google what an eye anatomy, Cleveland Clinic's image is perfect. And two, I know for a fact that Jenn carries eyeball gummies that, according to Goose and Bear, are delicious. And that would be the that would, also, I had them on my tray on my desk because, yes, I'm 100 years old and I have a platter of Werther's Originals and candies, and I had eyeballs. None of the grad students wanted the eyeballs, but my boys were like, Mom, we want all the eyeballs. But the eyeballs are pretty, the eyeball gummies are also pretty accurate according to her description and Cleveland Clinic. So there's that.
Maybe when I do in-person in-services, I should start just slicing open the eyeball gummy and using that.
For those of us that are neurodiverse in the back, that would help pay attention. Yes.
All right. So those are just the initial eye structures that we are thinking about. And there's also 3 types of muscles. So there are ocular muscles. Those are the muscles that actually rotate the eyes within the head. So if you're looking up, looking down, looking all around, the muscles that actually move your eye to point the different directions. There are pupillary muscles that controls the pupil size. And there are eyelid muscles. The eyelid muscles open and close your eyes for protection, for sleeping, for lubrication. So eye trackers use infrared light to shine into the eye through the pupil, which passes through the lens inside the eye and reflects off the retina at the back of the eye. This reflection illuminates the pupil and allows the eye tracker to find the eye. Every eye tracker will need some type of calibration. Every eye is shaped differently, and calibration takes images of the eye pointed at different directions to map the shape of the eye in order to determine where the user is looking.
Okay, so when I've done that previously with some of my patients, and some of them, I mean, they've had microcephaly, we've had strokes in utero, lots of different like etiologies, but I've had, I can't think of the term. It's on the grid, and then we like do the tracking program. Sorry, the sun just came in through the very large windows in my office, and now I can't see you. Speaking of like taking an infrared light to the eye, but that has allowed us like to track where the individual is looking at the screen or the grid. I can't, it was on Gridbox. I can't remember.
Are you talking about like a game, Michelle?
Yes, but it was also like the
Like
test
sometimes
prep.
they'll do like, yeah, like they'll have like, there's calibration that they'll do a lot with like dots on the screen, or like, you know, with
Yes.
kids they'll do like,
Yes, and then we can kind of see where their eyes naturally go to on to help us figure out where we need to position. Because if we've had little ones that track up to the upper left and they have a harder time because of, you know, whatever's going on with them physically, they can't get to the lower right, then if we move the full screen up, that might help them have like a better overall access to the complete screen. Does that make sense? I should have had a second cup of coffee. I've been at it for a little while today. Yeah.
Yeah, there are some people that'll be able to, with calibration, be able to access all areas of the screen, but not necessarily everyone. And sometimes that means moving things on the screen, like having the most important buttons located in a certain place on the screen. Sometimes that means moving the entire screen somewhere. So we will have initial like basic positioning recommendations, but if we find that for one particular individual it makes sense to have it in a slightly different place. There's not a right and wrong across the board for everyone. A lot of this is going to be specifically tailored to the individual. When you have complex vision and complex eye and complex positioning things going on, that is especially true. But also think about, the eye tracker does not actually know what an eye looks like. Like we know, we look at you, I can look at you on the tiny little thumbnail that I have on my laptop screen right now, and I can see your eye. And even though you're very small, I can actually tell where you're looking just because it is programmed into our brains that you can tell at just a glance what direction someone's eye is pointing. For a computer, they don't actually know what an eye even is. So they are programmed to find landmarks that indicate a pupil. So most pupils are circular and most retinas reflect light. But it's important for us to keep in mind that many people of all ages who may need alternate means of access, so the patients and students we're working with who will be using eye tracking as an access method, they often have complex eyes and complex bodies. So you might have a pupil that's so small that light has trouble passing through, or at least sufficient light to successfully track. The pupil can also be extremely large or dilated. This can be as a result of medications. This is something we see a lot with baclofen, which is a common medication for people with CP, but also with spinal cord injuries, ALS. And then
I had no idea.
oh yeah.
So what
And
does that do to its ability to track?
it depends. It really depends. So we always, well, that's baclofen is one of the medications that a lot of times makes eyes dilate. We see the opposite a lot of times with narcotic painkillers. So it'll be like a pinpoint pupil and very little light passing through. So thinking about light needs to pass through the eye in order for eye trackers to work. So anything that impedes that light can make eye tracking more difficult, if not impossible. So that can include cataracts. Cataracts is clouding of the lens inside the eye. So a lot of times people think of cataracts as something that older people get, but they can also be congenital. So they're both congenital or acquired. And they may or may not impact someone's vision, at least to the point that they notice it. So you might talk to someone and they say, oh yeah, I have cataracts in my right eye. Or they might not even know, especially if it has not impacted their vision. If you have someone who does not have vision difficulties that need something like glasses, they might not have been to an eye doctor to even know that there was a cataract there. They can form very, very slowly over time. So if you're not noticing that there's something impeding vision, you might not have had an appointment to take a look at that.
I have an eye disease that I learned about.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
Well, Michelle, I got anxious about it. Well, I have optic nerve drusen, which haven't really, I mean, I have astigmatism, so that's what's affected my vision. But then when I went down a rabbit hole and my one eye doctor was like, you could eventually lose your peripheral vision, but I've rarely seen, and all the research is like, it doesn't actually, the majority of the time, you don't tend to see too many deficits. But yeah, when I had my eye exam, my optic nerve lit up like a Christmas tree because it was all the calcium buildup in it. Mm-hmm.
That was, yes, that.
I panicked a little bit. So
As you should, but I mean, you saw the specialist. You've got the right doctor, and I mean,
no, I don't.
You're going to get the right person. We're claiming joy here.
We'll be all right. I can't do anything about it. You can't cure it. There's no cure.
Have you seen a neuro-ophthalmologist? A lot of times
there's some good ones in Cincinnati.
Yeah, that's a lot of times well, I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit, but a lot of times when questions come up, I think I said earlier in a different context, sometimes it's about knowing what questions to ask. So sometimes we'll have someone who's had a lot of difficulty and just didn't know why, and we'll come in and we still know it's not working, but at least we know where to direct the questions. And neuro-ophthalmology, they're not necessarily readily available. Sometimes their offices are not fully equipped to accommodate things like power wheelchairs. And so that makes specialist visits extra difficult sometimes. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot that we do know about the eye, and I say we meaning like myself, my colleagues. I am not an eye doctor of any flavor. So a lot of times, at least we'll know, okay, we have a question. We might take a screenshot and say, okay, let's take this to a physician who is an eye doctor. Ophthalmology is great. Neuro-ophthalmology, if possible, because they're the ones that will actually be able to address some of these things. So just the one more thing about, oh, yep,
No, I was just going to say, but these are the things that aren't covered in AAC class. I distinctly remember taking this amazing AAC class from an AAC user. She taught adjunct down at Old Dominion University because that's where I did my undergrad down in Norfolk, Virginia. And it was phenomenal, but it didn't take into account all of the medical stuff. But it's that interprofessional practice predicated upon interprofessional education. That's how we serve these individuals with complex bodies that, yes, being
Well,
a
and
lifelong
Michelle,
learner.
where I get frustrated is like, and this is not a knock to OTs at all. OTs have a lot of understanding about vision and they have a lot of understanding about access. But what I do find is because they don't have courses on AAC specifically, it kind of scares them a little bit, but they have this knowledge to help with the access. But it's kind of translating that, like, how is this relating to access to the device? Because I have a lot of OTs who are like, I don't do AAC, or I like, but they do, they just don't always know how they do, if that makes sense. And that's where I think some of that disconnect can happen if it's not an OT that's in a, in an environment that's what they're constantly doing.
Yeah, and there's, even when it's not explicitly AAC, there's so much of what OT does and PT as well.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on where you're located, what your clinic is, sometimes seating and positioning falls under OT, sometimes PT, and sometimes both. But if you have someone who is not in a good seating situation, that it's not always possible, but if that can be rectified first, that makes a lot of things, like everything else can kind of fall into place. So if you have someone who is, just as an example, I was speaking with an SLP I think it might have actually been Holly from the TTAC at Virginia Tech, and talking about, she's amazing. But we're talking about, if you have you have a student who doesn't necessarily have a lot of access to specialists, a lot of access to medical care, you might not have the option of going to someone for seating and positioning, getting a specialized custom chair built, especially with very young kids. It's expensive enough if you're a full-grown adult, but with kids are growing so fast. Like, I know, just thinking about shoes, I was a figure skater, and that is ridiculously expensive. And when you're a kid and your feet are growing fast, that's, every few months you're outgrowing it. How do you get a chair that's going to be comfortable and supportive and can also continue to be all of those things for multiple years? It's tough, but a lot of times you'll have someone who they don't have that kind of chair. So maybe they're in something that's closer to a stroller or a very basic, like, transport wheelchair that's way too big. So you don't have the torso support, you don't have the neck support, you're kind of flopping all over the place. It's, how do you do eye tracking when you're not stable and you're not comfortable? So yeah, there are a lot of pieces, and we try to do some thorough pre-screening before even scheduling a demo. So if someone were to reach out to us and say, we think this might work, can we try it? Usually we want to start by saying, it's great to talk with you. Let me ask you some questions. So before we even schedule an appointment to meet up, we're going to say, okay, first off, how are you currently communicating? So is this someone who has been in the situation they're in? Was this like a recent disease process change? Was this a recent accident or injury? Was this something that you've been dealing with for multiple years? Are you currently speaking? If you're not speaking, do you have something that you do to communicate with the people around you, whether that is with low-tech AAC, whether that is using sign, whether that's something like ASL or even makeshift signs. Sometimes people come up with gestures just within a family. Is this, just grimacing? They're not speaking, but you can tell by a facial expression if something is making them unhappy or very excited. Are they very still when they're not excited about something, but when they are excited about something, maybe they'll kick out a leg. There's a lot of times, especially if you're talking with parents, sometimes the response will be like, "Oh, they don't communicate, but I know what they want or what they need." And so a lot of times we need to kind of dig deeper. And this is the SLPs in particular are generally pretty good at this. What the parent or whoever we're talking to, caregiver, is thinking of as communication. Again, I'm doing air quotes. We know that all of
I
those
love that you say that. That's amazing. Thank you.
but we know those facial expressions, those flailing out an arm when you're trying to get someone's attention, or if you're just happy or excited or interesting or angry, we recognize that all of that is communication. You don't have to be speaking or writing or typing or signing to be communicating. So sometimes it's not just we're not just asking a yes no question, where we want to dig a little bit more, just to know when we're going in. The next big one is, how is their vision? So we want to know, is there any history of eye surgery? Sometimes I don't use the word surgery anymore. I'll say procedure. I had someone who told me they had never, ever had eye surgery. And then we had our appointment, and I'm looking at the eye image that you have on our particular device, and I'm seeing something that is looking curious to me. So I said, "Have you ever had cataracts removed?" She goes, "Oh, yeah." So cataract removal is just such a common procedure now. It is very likely that the doctor that did the procedure never called it surgery. It's done outpatient. It's very quick. It's very routine. Tons of people get it. So she didn't think of it as surgery, but she had had a procedure, air quotes, and she had had lens replacement surgery.
That if you go a little bit further into the mountains and you say, "Do you have the diabetes?" They're not going to know it. But if you say, "You got the sugars, honey, how your sugars doing?" Everybody has the sugars, but diabetes it's just not a term that everybody knows. It's just, yeah, code switching.
Yeah, technical jargon versus what are the words that folks are actually using, and how are they describing in their own words. And then also, do they wear glasses or contacts? There are a lot of folks who have what you might consider a normal eye history, but they've worn glasses for years, or maybe they just started wearing readers, or I wear glasses. I've been wearing glasses since 5th grade. I didn't really know how glasses worked until I started doing this job and learned, oh, that's what the lens is doing to make it so I can see.
Now, when you ask these questions, who are you meeting with? Are you like when the folks call in to like do the screen? Are they meeting? Is it the caregiver, the patient, the clinician? Who can call in? Sorry, we got so excited, and then I was like, "Wait, back up! I need to know that part of it."
Yeah,
Yeah.
no. The answer to your question is yes. It was not a yes or no question, but the answer is yes. We have folks who find us online and reach out through our website. We have clinicians that reach out because we've worked with them before, or we've worked with one of their colleagues before. So when we are having these very initial conversations, sometimes it's with a clinician, Sometimes it's with the patient themselves, depending on what their diagnosis is, what their situation is. Sometimes it's a family member. So it might be the direct caregiver. It might be, my cousin is going through this right now and they seem really overwhelmed. So I figured that I would help out by reaching out. I've had emails from a neighbor or a family friend. So that very initial outreach, and sometimes it's just, I found you, I'm curious how this works. They might not even tell us up front because I have a person in mind I think could benefit. They're just like, what is this? I've never heard of this. How does this work? How does one go about getting it? And, like a lot of things, like obviously you could just, here's my credit card number. Thank you for this purchase. But for the most part, we have folks who are using insurance. And so there's a whole process that goes through. And with school systems, sometimes that's even more different because sometimes students who are in public schools will be using health insurance. Sometimes the school system will have other procedures in place. So it really depends on the person. It depends on the state. Sometimes it depends on the county or something even smaller. So yeah, there's a lot of questions we ask. I'm usually asking the clinical questions, but we have funding questions as well. And that is its own its own podcast.
Mm-hmm.
But
I do have an eye question.
yeah.
What, in regards to like fatigue, it feels like based on how you're describing it, it feels very passive in the way that the camera is kind of looking at the eye. And I worked with a lot of girls with Rett syndrome. I worked at the Rett syndrome clinic in Shriners when I was in South Carolina. And a lot of them had Eyegaze. And I know the caregivers, like a lot of their questions would be like, how much effort, and I know it's different with every child, but what do you notice in regards to someone that's using an Eyegaze most of the time with how much effort their eyes are using, if that makes sense as a question?
Absolutely. And that's a big concern that I think a lot of people have, is how fatiguing, how tiring it would be. So this, I'm going to go back to, I was talking about the types of muscles in the eye. So those ocular muscles, the actual muscles that rotate the eye within the head, those muscles do not fatigue. That is the same type of muscle as the heart muscle. If you think of when we are asleep, our eyes are moving. You might have seen like pictures or videos, I guess, of someone who's dreaming, who's in REM sleep, and their eye is moving even though it is closed. So those muscles do not fatigue. Eyelid muscles, so the muscles we use to blink, can fatigue. So we have a couple things at play here. We have, first off, where is your device positioned? So there is a way to optimally position a device to minimize fatigue. We like to have it so you do not have to look up, because that can be, so just right now, again, I know that folks out there in podcast land cannot see us, but keep your head on straight, but with just your eyes, look up at the ceiling for about 2 seconds. Can you feel that? You can feel that pull. That was a very short period of time. So obviously we're not going to have the device on the ceiling, but just the act of looking up causes that pull. If you're doing that for more time, that's going to be more tiring. Also, infrared light is warm light. So warm light will potentially dry the eye faster. When eyes are dry, you need to blink. When you're blinking more, that's using those eyelid muscles. So of all of the devices, exactly, all the devices out there use infrared light. They do not all use the same amount of infrared light. So some devices use one single infrared LED, others use a whole array of lights. At the same time, devices that use a whole array of lights might have a wider head box. So not more accuracy, but just a bigger area. So someone who has more movement might benefit from a larger area, what we call a head box, the entire area that a camera can see. So it's not that, oh, more light is better, oh, less light is better. It really depends on the individual. And that's one of the big pieces that the gold standard, the recommendation is to try at least 3 different devices from different manufacturers. That's the asterisk there, from different manufacturers, because different cameras function in a different way. And if you haven't tried, it's kind of like test driving a car. If you have never tried it, you don't know what the difference is. You want to find what is going to be the most comfortable, what is going to feel the most accurate. And it does not matter what I think. What matters is when the device is being used by the person, what it feels like for that person.
I like what you said too. I think that, unfortunately, and I don't view it this way, but it feels like in a lot of places, the child almost has to like earn the device, if that makes any sense. Like, which is so unfortunate because you shouldn't have to earn communication. But it's like if one thing doesn't work, and my focus, very individualized, very trauma informed care. And with that involves a lot of time and effort to understand that client, patient, wherever they're coming from. And people, and I learned this from Michelle, like I'll introduce high tech super early, especially if I know a patient's diagnosis. And sometimes I'll have to go to Eyegaze first because of their motor differences, knowing that there might be a point in time where direct access is an option. Or like, I think that's where it can be difficult too. It's like they deserve communication now. It might change with how they want to access a device, and finding that balance of, is it going to stick with them? But how is it best for them to communicate in this moment when their communication is just as valid too, as opposed to, they're not ready for it yet, which really bothers me.
With AAC, I feel like we spend all this time talking about feature matching, which is fantastic when you know what features you're matching. But for a lot of the people that we're working with, whether these are pediatric patients or students, or these are our adults, have you been able to complete a comprehensive language and cognition assessment? That's an important question. If the answer is,
what's the bias in the test that you selected? Can we go back to that one? But okay.
I mean, can I do basic orientation questions with you? Can I get a yes, no response from you? Do I know if you are understanding the things that I am saying to you? If we don't have the ability, if this person does not have the ability to either speak or make some kind of gesture that we know what it means, that means that what features are being matched. So
which are most of Michelle and I's patients, the ones that we're really trying to give them an opportunity to communicate. We use the communication matrix a lot, which I love because it allows you to really pick up those very subtle cues of communication. Like I vividly remember having this patient with Rett syndrome come in. She was older, maybe almost 10. And you could, she was so engaged with mom, had so many things to say, was non-speaking, and her device was overwhelming to caregiver. So did I know fully from the patient that it was overwhelming to her? No, but her cues were telling me it was, because she wasn't using it. And I remember like mom was like, I just want her to, to hear I love you, or to hear something like that. And I had to advocate for what she wanted to say on the device. Like she loved poop jokes. So we put fart jokes on there, but also had to advocate to mom that every time she reached back and touched her, she was saying, I trust you and I love you. So it's such a balance of like not, and we know this, we all do it, but like such a balance of helping caregiver. And I don't know if you get this. We could talk forever, so I will shut up in a second, I promise. But I have a lot of families that will be like, they don't really use the device at home. And sometimes that I go, when you go home from work and you're exhausted and you've worked so hard all day, sometimes you just want to sit on the couch and put your hand on the other person's lap. Like some of that is just, you get me, and I don't feel the need to use it. But I I just went down a rabbit hole. I'm really sorry. But I don't know what my point was. I'm appreciative of like your advocacy for working with that family, working with that client, taking the time to understand them to provide what they want, even though it's going to take a lot of work if, like you said, we don't have as much data from them.
Yeah, sometimes what that means is, first off, making sure we're all on the same page before we start so that we don't have unrealistic expectations. But coming in with the device, with the understanding, this is not a device trial that's going to determine if you are going to be successful using this device. This is me bringing this device that we can use as an assessment tool. And what does that mean for, just sticking with this example with a pediatric patient? What does that language assessment look like? So what I was taught in school and what all of the literature tells us is that for a child language assessment, this is accomplished with play. You're not going to sit a 3-year-old at a table, expect them to sit quietly while you just show them pictures and demand that they name them. So just because
Can you put that on repeat? Because this is the dynamic assessment. A standardized assessment alone does not capture what our children are capable of doing. And if we learn through play and truly seek to understand what gets them excited, that's where.
Yeah, it doesn't capture what they want to communicate.
Yes.
If we don't let them play,
that's just putting so many demands. It does not matter if you're talking about, a typically developing child with, this is not any kind of special education scenario. You are just talking about a kid in preschool who is going about a task. Like, that's just not something that's not expectation that is being put on this child. So why should this be different because we have this high-tech device? So there are ways to incorporate play. And that might mean, we know that we need calibration in order to be accurate with the tracking for you to access this device. But that's not what we're trying to do right now. What we're trying to do is this something that is of interest to you? If I'm working with an adult with ALS, I put a device in front of them and say, look at the yellow ball, and it'll, take a measurement of your eye and move on to the next one. Okay, here's a keyboard, spell your name. I'm not doing that with a child. I'm also not doing that with adults who have potentially cognitive communication deficits, and we're not exactly sure what they are. So this is more, okay, I have a young child. It's very possible, especially now that it is 2024, that they have had screen time. They know what that is. They've had an iPad in front of them and it's playing Cocomelon, and that is not an unusual occurrence. I can't just say to this child, hey, this is an interactive screen, and if you look at a thing, it'll do a thing. That's not how this works. They have to experience that and make that connection. They have to have that little light bulb moment. I cannot lecture this young child until they get that. It is up to them to get the opportunity to explore until they realize, wait a second. Every time I looked at that button, it played that song and showed me that thing. And that very likely means I'm going to put it in front of them and I'm going to walk away. Depending on the age of this child and their safety, we're not going far. We're not necessarily leaving the room. But, we're going to be over here chatting, and we're just going to put this in front of them and just kind of see what happens. They are exploring. They are the child who is sitting on the play mat, and they are picking up the toy and they're turning it around and they're poking it with their finger and they may be putting it in their mouth. That's what their classmates are doing. They are getting the same opportunity. They're just using their eyes. So we have just a very simple cause and effect type of page that all that it does, if you look at something, something happens. Just the software that's on the device that our company has. So the Eyegaze Edge has software called Mind Express. And there's one of the cause and effect pages is a pile of leaves. Like it's fall and you've been raking, there's a pile of leaves. As you look around, the leaf will disappear. And at the bottom of the pile of leaves, there's like a ladybug or, some little cute kind of thing, but you have to lift all the leaves in order to see the thing at the bottom. There's just a very, very basic, there's no right and wrong. There's no expectation of any kind. This is just exploration. Is it going to immediately click? Not necessarily, but it's just kind of exploring. You know what? I don't think so. And that, I feel like for a lot of folks, and this is not just for children, I feel like that would be, there is one, it is not farts. I do apologize, but there is one there's like an opera singer and a tomato appears on the screen. And if you look at it, it'll throw it at the opera singer. And the first time I saw that, I was like, wait, that's mean. Like, you know what? There's going to be kids, and that is the one that is going to be effective. So there you go.
I've seen the pie splat one and the fart ones with maybe
there is one and I'm just not familiar with it.
Okay, that's my request. I like the fart one. I mean, also boy mom life, but farts are fabulous. So unless it happens on your foot when you're cuddling up next to your child, that's not, oh God, you have no idea. Yeah.
There are certain things that can unite everyone, and sometimes everyone just needs a little giggle. I don't think there's any age limit on the fart jokes. So
no. Okay. All right. So I'm aware of the bad news that we have to wrap up because I have to go to a practicum planning meeting in 5 minutes. And so, Jenn, this is amazing. Can we please schedule for a part 2?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like we could go on we have a lot of things we can talk about for sure.
I know, because we barely got through we got through some anatomy, but we teased into the CVI stuff and we just got into the components of the eval. But I want to know what it looks like when you're going through the process into intervention and what the program systems are, or what are the alternatives if the Eyegaze doesn't work, or say their disease progression is not deterioration, but the prognosis is optimal. And then how do we teach how to use direct access? You see, all the things.
I agree. All of those things.
Okay. All of those things. I'm very excited. I got so excited I had to move. I was like, I need the sun on my back. I have to be able to see because this is fantastic. Okay. All right. So then on that note, one, what are your final thoughts for now? Because I feel like we cut you off midstream, but I have to go see Geraldine.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I think the biggest pieces to keep in mind, that pre-screening, how do you know if this person is if this is a potential access method for the person that you're working with? And it might be very obvious to you, and it might be, I'm not sure if this is going to be the right path for this person. For that kind of question, I would recommend reaching out. You're welcome to reach out to me, whether it is specifically for this company or just about eye tracking in general. We welcome those questions. We get questions from folks who have devices from other manufacturers a lot of the time. We're happy to kind of bounce ideas around there. Because it might be that it's not a no, but it's a let's get another specialist visit first so that we have more information going in, if that is even a possibility. And yeah, I think that's really the biggest takeaway, at least of this. We like to be curious about the eye. One thing that I did not mention, the last and really important question about that pre-screening is, do they have volitional eye movement? Can they not track something across the screen, but volitionally, can you just ask them, look up, down, left, right? Can their eyes move in those directions? If the answer is no, that does not necessarily mean this is not the right access method for them, but it gives us a lot of important information going in. There are some people who have had brainstem stroke or other brain injuries, and their eyes maybe only move up and down and they don't move left to right. So that might be something that is obvious just by saying, look up, look down, look left, look right. That said, you might not see it until you put a device in front of them and say, that's interesting. Let's explore that further. So
we didn't even get into nystagmus, because that makes me think about nystagmus when there's okay, so we'll have to pick up with nystagmus.
That was the
and
part two.
Yes. Okay, so then part two, we'll start
we
with
can talk about
nystagmus.
nystagmus. We can talk about strabismus. We can talk about, we've got all kinds of things we can talk about. I don't think I talked about ptosis. That's when the eyelid blocks part of the pupil. So we've got all kinds of things that can potentially, interact with eye tracking.
Yes. Okay. So we'll do, do round two. Okay. So then on that note, if somebody's listening right now and they have a question, how can they reach you?
Yeah. And I will make sure that you have this information to put in your show notes as well. But our company phone number is 1-800-Eyegaze, Eyegaze. So that reaches us in Fairfax, Virginia. So that's East Coast US time. And my email, it might be easiest for me to just give you my email to put in there, because my name's kind of long, but my name is Jenn Rubenstein. So it's JENN.RUBENSTEIN@EYEGAZE.com.
Beautiful. And folks, they have a Instagram account as well. It's simply called Eyegaze. That's the handle name. Eyegaze, Gaze. So be sure to check them out on the land of Instagram. And then the question that I love to ask, if somebody has any love money lying around, do you have an organization, an entity, a nonprofit that they could donate to, something that means a lot to your heart? It can be SLP related or not SLP related. Where would we sprinkle joy to?
Oh, goodness. I did not do a good job of preparing for this in advance. I think for part two, I'll have another one. So I'll think for this one, I'll start by throwing out, there are local chapters of the ALS Association all over the country, and they provide a lot of services, including support with assistive technology. That is a pretty great one. I guess while I'm on that note, speaking of ALS, there's an organization based in New Orleans called Team Gleason that was started by Steve Gleason, who is a former NFL player for the New Orleans Saints who has ALS. And the support that they provide to folks with ALS all over the country is just incredible.
I hadn't heard about either one of those. So yes, I love doing this and finding out where people want to send joy, because it's always so impactful and personal, and it's just lovely. But yes. Okay. You are freaking amazing. Erin and I are so grateful that you came on. We will, folks, be sure to check out First Bite Podcast on Instagram, as well as the land of the Facebooks. And we will get you scheduled for part two, maybe part three. Yay!
Thank you for joining us for today's course. To complete the course, you must log into your account and complete the quiz and the survey. If you have indicated that you are part of the ASHA registry and entered both your ASHA number and a complete mailing address in your account profile prior to course completion, we will submit earned CEUs to ASHA. Please allow 1 to 2 months from the completion date for your CEUs to reflect on your ASHA transcript. Please note that if this information is missing, we cannot submit to ASHA on your behalf. Thanks again for joining us. We hope to see you next time.
Feeding Matters guides system-wide changes by uniting caregivers, professionals, and community partners under the Pediatric Feeding Disorder Alliance. So what is this alliance? The Alliance is an open access collaborative community focused on achieving strategic goals within 3 focus areas: education, advocacy, and research. So who is the Alliance? It's you. The Alliance is open to any person passionate about improving care for children with a pediatric feeding disorder. To date, 187 professionals, caregivers, and partners have joined the Alliance. You can join today by visiting the Feeding Matters website at www.feedingmatters.org. Click on PFD Alliance tab and sign up today. Change is possible when we work together. That's a wrap, folks. Once again, thank you for listening to First Bite, fed, fun, and functional. I'm your humble but yet sassy host, Michelle Dawson, the All Things Peds SLP. This podcast is part of a course offered for continuing education through speechtherapypd.com. Please check out the website if you'd like to learn more about CEU opportunities for this episode, as well as the ones that are archived. And as always, remember, feed your mind, feed your soul, be kind, and feed those babies.